Looking down at my empty jewelry box, my heart stopped. The custom 3-carat engagement ring David had designed for me, worth $120,000 and containing my grandmother's heirloom diamonds, was gone. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just the missing ring. It was the text I'd received 3 hours earlier from my sister Rachel saying, "Thanks for letting me borrow your ring for the photos, sis. You're the best." The problem? I never gave her permission to take anything, and in exactly 3 hours, she was walking down the aisle wearing my stolen ring at her wedding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm speaking to you from what should have been the happiest month of my life. David had proposed just 6 weeks earlier in the most thoughtful way imaginable. He'd worked with brilliant diamonds downtown for 3 months to create something unique, incorporating the diamonds from our grandmother's vintage ring that my mother had given me years ago. The center stone was a flawless 3-carat diamond, surrounded by deep blue sapphires that matched my eyes, set in platinum with delicate engraving along the band. It wasn't just expensive. It was irreplaceable. Those diamonds had been in our family for 4 generations, passed down from mother to daughter, and now they were supposed to be mine forever. I'd been so careful with it, taking it to the jeweler just last week for a professional cleaning, and to have the prongs checked. The insurance documentation was meticulous, the appraisal recent, every detail photographed and cataloged. I kept it in a velvet-lined jewelry box in my bedroom, when I wasn't wearing it, never leaving it out, never being careless. David and I had even discussed getting a safety deposit box, but I loved looking at it too much, loved the way it caught the morning light streaming through my apartment windows in Cedar Park. Rachel had been acting strange for weeks, asking odd questions about the ring, wanting to see it constantly, making comments about how her own engagement ring from Kyle looked so plain in comparison. She'd say things like, "God, Jess, that thing is like a small car payment, and Kyle's ring is nice, but yours is like something a celebrity would wear." I thought it was just sister envy, the kind of harmless jealousy that happens in families. Our parents had always made it clear that I was the responsible one, the one who saved money and made smart choices, while Rachel was the free spirit who lived paycheck to paycheck and never planned ahead. What I didn't realize was that Rachel had been planning something far more calculated than simple jealousy. 2 weeks before her wedding at the Grand Oaks Country Club, she'd started coming by my apartment more frequently. She'd bring coffee, want to hang out, always finding excuses to go into my bedroom to chat while I got ready for work. I thought she was nervous about the wedding, maybe wanting to bond with her older sister before this big life change. I was touched by the attention, honestly. Rachel and I had always had a complicated relationship, competing for our parents' approval, fighting over everything from clothes to boyfriends in high school. This felt like we were finally growing up, becoming real friends. The morning I discovered the ring missing, I'd planned to wear it to a client meeting downtown. I was representing our marketing firm in a pitch for a major hotel chain, and I wanted to look polished, confident, successful. The ring always made me feel that way, like I was wearing my future on my finger, a tangible reminder that someone loved me enough to invest in forever. I reached into the jewelry box where I always kept it, my fingers searching the familiar velvet grooves, and felt nothing but empty space. My first thought wasn't theft, it was panic. Had I left it at David's apartment? Had I forgotten and worn it somewhere unusual? I tore through my bedroom, checking every surface, every drawer, even looking under the bed like it might have somehow fallen and rolled away. I called David, my voice shaking, and he immediately offered to come over and help me search. We spent an hour methodically going through everything, checking coat pockets, purse compartments, anywhere I might have absent-mindedly placed it. That's when my phone buzzed with Rachel's text message. "Thanks for letting me borrow your ring for the photos, sis. You're the best." followed by a heart emoji, and a picture of her hand wearing my ring, clearly taken at a professional photography studio. The image showed my unmistakable ring on her finger, the sapphires catching the studio lights, the engraving visible along the band. She was wearing it like it belonged to her, like she had every right to it. I stared at the photo for a long moment, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Then I called her immediately. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding breathless and happy. "Jess, hey, I was just about to call you back. The photos turned out amazing. Your ring photographs so much better than mine. The diamonds just sparkle like crazy under the lights." "Rachel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "when did I say you could borrow my ring?" There was a pause, and I could hear wedding music playing in the background, people talking and laughing. She was clearly at some kind of wedding preparation event, surrounded by bridesmaids and family. "Oh, come on. Don't be dramatic. You weren't wearing it, and I just needed it for a few pictures." Kyle's ring looked so cheap next to the dress, and you know how important these photos are. They're going in the wedding album forever. "Rachel, that ring is worth more than most people's cars. You can't just take it without asking." "I'm not keeping it," she laughed, but there was an edge to her voice now. "God, you act like I'm some kind of criminal. We're sisters. What's yours is mine." "Right, that's what family does. Besides, you'll get it back after the wedding. It's not like I'm running off to Vegas with it." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean after the wedding?" "Rachel, I want it back right now." "I can't give it back right now, Jess. I'm getting married in 3 hours. All the photos are planned around this ring. The photographers are expecting it. The whole bridal party has seen it. Kyle thinks it's mine now. I can't just suddenly show up with a different ring. People will ask questions." "People should ask questions. It's not your ring." "Look," she said, and her voice was getting harder, less apologetic. "I'll give it back tomorrow, okay? After the honeymoon maybe. We're going to Cabo for 2 weeks, and it'll be safer with me than sitting in your apartment anyway. You should thank me for taking such good care of it." I hung up on her. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. David was watching me with growing alarm, and when I told him what Rachel had said, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, protective fury. "She stole your engagement ring, and she's planning to wear it at her own wedding. She says she's borrowing it. Taking something without permission is stealing, Jess, and saying she might keep it for 2 weeks. That's not borrowing, that's theft." I knew he was right, but
preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
the family dynamics were complicated. My parents had always expected me to be the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over Rachel's impulsive decisions and dramatic outbursts. When we were kids, if Rachel broke something or got into trouble, I was the one who helped cover for her, who gave up my own things to make her happy, who apologized for her when she wouldn't apologize herself. My mother would say things like, "You're the older sister, Jessica. You need to set a good example, and Rachel doesn't mean any harm. She just acts without thinking." But this felt different. This wasn't Rachel borrowing a sweater or using my car without asking. This was a 6-figure piece of jewelry with irreplaceable sentimental value, and she'd taken it on one of the most important days of her life, when getting it back would be nearly impossible. The more I thought about it, the more calculated it seemed. She'd been visiting more often, asking about the ring, getting familiar with my apartment layout and my routines. She knew I kept it in the jewelry box. She knew I wouldn't notice it missing until I specifically looked for it. And she'd planned to take it right before her wedding, when the family pressure to not make a scene would be at its highest. I walked to my laptop and opened a new document. If Rachel wanted to play games with my property, I was going to document everything. I started with the timeline, noting every conversation we'd had about the ring, every visit she'd made to my apartment, every strange comment or question. I screenshotted her text message and the photo of her wearing my ring. I pulled out the insurance paperwork, the purchase receipts from Brilliant Diamonds, the appraisal documentation, everything that proved the ring belonged to me. David was watching me work, and after a few minutes he said quietly, "You're not just going to let her get away with this, are you?" "No," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I'm not." I called the non-emergency police number and explained the situation. The dispatcher was professional, but seemed skeptical. "So your sister borrowed your ring without permission, and she's planning to return it after her wedding. She took it without asking." "Yes, and she's saying she might keep it for 2 weeks while she goes on her honeymoon. The ring is worth over $100,000. There was a pause. "Ma'am, that changes things significantly. That's grand theft. Do you want to file a report?" I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, I do." The officer who came to take my statement was Detective Sarah Williams, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, took photos of all my documentation, and asked detailed questions about Rachel's access to my apartment and her history of taking things without permission. When I mentioned that Rachel was planning to wear the ring at her wedding in 2 hours, Detective Williams raised her eyebrows. "That's pretty bold," she said. "Most thieves try to hide stolen property, not display it at a public event with hundreds of witnesses. I think she's counting on me not wanting to cause a scene at her wedding. Are you willing to cause a scene?" I thought about it for a moment. 3 hours ago the answer would have been no. I would have done anything to avoid family drama, to keep the peace, to protect Rachel from the consequences of her own actions. But sitting there with all the evidence spread out on my coffee table, looking at the photo of my stolen ring on her finger, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about keeping the peace anymore. This was about someone stealing from me and expecting me to be grateful for it. "Yes," I said, "I am." Detective Williams nodded approvingly. "Good, because we're going to need you to be very sure about this. Once we show up at that wedding, there's no taking it back. Your sister will be arrested in front of her entire family and all her guests. This will become very public, very quickly." "She made it public when she posted that photo," I said. "She could have taken the ring and hidden it, could have pretended she didn't know where it was. Instead, she sent me a picture of herself wearing it and told me I should be grateful." David reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. Detective Williams spent another hour gathering information, including contact details for the wedding venue and the names of key family members who would be present. She explained that they would need to coordinate with venue security and approach the situation carefully to avoid creating a dangerous situation. "Wedding crashers with badges tend to make people nervous," she said with a slight smile. As she was leaving, she turned back to me. "Jessica, I want you to understand something. What your sister did isn't just theft, it's betrayal. She violated your trust, invaded your privacy, and then tried to manipulate you into accepting it. You're not overreacting by involving law enforcement. You're protecting yourself and setting boundaries. That's healthy." After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling oddly calm. David had offered to stay with me, but I wanted some time alone to process what was happening. In 3 hours, my sister would be walking down the aisle at the Grand Oaks Country Club, wearing my stolen engagement ring, and 2 hours after that, police would be escorting her away in handcuffs. Part of me felt sick about it, imagining my parents' faces, the shock and humiliation of the wedding guests, the way this would fracture our family permanently. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to rescue Rachel from the consequences of her choices. I wasn't going to sacrifice my own well-being to protect her from her own behavior. I wasn't going to smile and pretend everything was fine while she walked all over me. I picked up my phone and did something I'd never done before. I blocked Rachel's number, then I called my mother. "Jessica, honey, we're getting ready for photos. Can this wait? Mom, Rachel stole my engagement ring. She took it from my apartment without permission, and she's planning to wear it at her wedding today." There was a long silence. Then, in the careful tone my mother used when she was trying to manage family drama, she said, "Now, Jessica, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Rachel mentioned she was borrowing something from you for the photos. She never asked to borrow it, she just took it, and it's worth $120,000, Mom. It has Grandma's diamonds in it. Well, I'm sure she'll give it back after the wedding. You know how emotional she gets about big events. She probably just wanted to feel special. She wanted to feel special, so she committed grand theft." "Jessica, please don't be dramatic. It's her wedding day." And there it was, the same response I'd been getting my entire life. Rachel's feelings mattered more than my boundaries. Rachel's happiness was more important than my rights. Rachel's special day justified any behavior, no matter how harmful or illegal. "Mom, I've filed a police report. They're going to arrest her at the wedding." The silence this time was much longer. When my mother spoke again, her voice was cold and sharp. "Jessica Marie Martinez, you will not ruin your sister's wedding over a piece of jewelry. I don't care how expensive it is. It's not just a piece of jewelry, Mom, it's my engagement ring. It has our family diamonds in it, and she stole it. You take that police report back right now, or so help me, you will not be welcome in this family anymore." I looked around my quiet apartment, at the empty jewelry box, still sitting on my dresser, at the documentation spread across my coffee table, proving that someone I loved had betrayed me in the most calculated way possible. Then I looked at my left hand, where my engagement ring should have been, where it would have been if my own sister hadn't decided that her wants mattered more than my property rights. "Okay, Mom," I said quietly, "I understand," and I hung up. An hour after hanging up on my mother, I was sitting in my car outside the Grand Oaks Country Club, watching the most beautiful wedding setup I'd ever seen slowly transform into what would soon become a crime scene. The parking lot was filling with luxury cars, guests in designer dresses, and expensive suits laughing as they walked toward the entrance, completely unaware that the bride was currently wearing stolen property worth more than most of their annual salaries. White roses and eucalyptus garlands draped every surface, string quartet music drifted through the warm Texas air, and photographer assistants rushed around capturing the perfect pre-ceremony moments. I wasn't supposed to be here, after my mother's ultimatum, after she'd made it clear that protecting Rachel mattered more than supporting me. I'd originally planned to stay home and let the police handle everything without witnessing the aftermath firsthand. But something had drawn me here anyway, maybe the need to see this through to the end, maybe the desire to witness the moment when actions finally met consequences, or maybe just the simple fact that this was my ring and I wanted to be present when it was returned to me. Detective Williams had texted me 30 minutes earlier with an update on their plan. They'd coordinated with venue security and would be positioned discreetly around the property during the ceremony. The arrest would happen during the cocktail hour, after the formal photos were completed but before the reception dinner began, minimizing the disruption to other guests while ensuring maximum witnesses to corroborate the theft. She'd also mentioned that they'd obtained security footage from my apartment building, showing Rachel entering my unit the day before with her own key, a key I'd given her months ago for emergencies, staying for approximately 15 minutes. And leaving with a small bag that hadn't been in her possession when she arrived. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd given her the very tool she'd used to betray me. That emergency key was meant for situations like me being locked out or needing someone to feed my cat when I traveled for work. Instead, Rachel had used it to plan and execute the theft of the most valuable thing I owned, timing it perfectly for maximum emotional manipulation. She'd known I would discover the missing ring on her wedding day. She'd known the family pressure to stay quiet would be overwhelming. She'd counted on my lifelong pattern of prioritizing family harmony over my own well-being. From my car, I could see the bridal party gathering for photos near the gazebo where the ceremony would take place. Rachel looked absolutely stunning in her flowing ivory gown, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style that showcased the diamond earrings that had been our grandmother's, another family heirloom that my mother had given her for the wedding, but it was her left hand that made my stomach clench with anger and grief. Even from this distance, I could see my ring catching the sunlight, the 3-carat center diamond sparkling exactly the way it did when I wore it, the sapphire accents creating flashes of deep blue that complemented her bouquet perfectly. She was posing for photos with her hand positioned prominently, showing off the ring to the photographer, to Kyle, to the bridesmaids who kept exclaiming over how gorgeous it was. I watched my sister living her dream wedding moment while wearing the symbol of my own engagement, my own future, my own family history. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't desperate theft born from financial hardship or addiction. This was calculated appropriation of something precious simply because she wanted it and believed she was entitled to take it. My phone rang, and David's name appeared on the screen. I'd asked him to stay away from the venue, not wanting him to become collateral damage in what was about to unfold, but I was grateful to hear his voice. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. "I'm watching her pose for wedding photos wearing our ring," I said, surprised that my voice sounded steady. "She looks happy, really genuinely happy, like she has no guilt at all about what she's done. That tells you everything you need to know about who she really is," David replied. "Someone who feels genuine remorse doesn't flaunt stolen property at their own wedding." He was right, but it still hurt to accept. This wasn't Rachel making a thoughtless mistake or acting impulsively in a moment of weakness. This was Rachel methodically planning to steal from me, and then celebrating that theft in the most public way possible. She'd turned my engagement ring into a prop in her own love story, and she'd done it knowing exactly how much it would hurt me. Through the passenger window, I watched Kyle lift Rachel's hand to kiss it, his lips brushing against my stolen ring. The gesture that should have been romantic became grotesque when I realized he had no idea he was kissing stolen property. Did he think she'd somehow afforded a 6-figure ring on her retail manager salary? Had she lied to him about where it came from, or had she simply let him assume it was within their budget? The thought that Kyle might be completely innocent in this made me feel slightly sick. He was about to marry someone who was either a liar or a thief, or more likely, both. 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I saw my parents arrive. My father looked distinguished in his navy suit, my mother elegant in a dusty rose dress that complemented her silver hair. They walked toward the entrance with the confident bearing of people who belonged here, people whose daughter was getting married in style at one of Austin's most prestigious venues. I wondered if they'd told other family members about my dramatic overreaction to Rachel's harmless borrowing. I wondered if they'd painted me as the jealous older sister who couldn't stand to see Rachel happy. My mother's phone rang as they approached the entrance, and I saw her face change as she answered it. Even from this distance, I could tell the conversation was tense. She kept glancing around nervously, and my father moved closer to her, his expression growing concerned. After a few minutes, she hung up and said something to him that made his face go pale. They hurried inside, but not before I saw my mother pull out her phone again and start typing frantically. My own phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and I realized my mother must have gotten it from Rachel since I'd blocked my sister's calls. "Jessica, this is Rachel. Mom told me you actually called the police. Please tell me this is some kind of joke. You cannot seriously be planning to have me arrested at my own wedding over a ring I was planning to give back anyway. This is insane. Call off the police right now, and we can work this out like adults." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "You worked it out when you decided to steal from me. Enjoy your ceremony." The response came immediately, "I cannot believe you would do this to me.
Yeah.
You are destroying the most important day of my life over a stupid ring. I hate you." I took a screenshot of both messages and forwarded them to Detective Williams. The police would want to see Rachel's admission that she'd taken the ring, and her complete lack of remorse or accountability. These texts would become evidence in the criminal case against her, proof that she understood exactly what she'd done, and was angry at being caught rather than sorry for stealing. The ceremony began on schedule, and I found myself in the surreal position of watching my sister get married while wearing my stolen ring, and knowing that in 90 minutes, she'd be under arrest. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon as the bridesmaids walked down the aisle in their sage green dresses, followed by Rachel in her stunning gown, my ring glittering on her finger as she carried her bouquet of white peonies and eucalyptus. The guests stood and turned to watch her processional, phones and cameras capturing every moment of what they thought was a perfect fairy tale wedding. Kyle's face lit up when he saw her, and I felt a stab of genuine sadness for him. Whatever Rachel's flaws, he clearly loved her deeply, and his world was about to implode in the most public way possible. When the officiant asked if anyone had a reason these two should not be wed, I thought grimly that I could have raised my hand and announced that the bride was currently wearing stolen property, but I stayed silent in my car. The police would make their statement soon enough. The ceremony itself was beautiful, I had to admit. Rachel had always had excellent taste in aesthetics, and she'd clearly spent months planning every detail to perfection. The venue was stunning, the flowers were gorgeous, and the couple looked genuinely happy as they exchanged vows. If I hadn't known that Rachel was wearing my stolen ring, if I hadn't spent the morning filing police reports and blocking family members who expected me to tolerate theft in the name of family harmony, I might have been moved by the romantic scene unfolding before me. Instead, I found myself cataloging details that would matter to the investigation. The professional photographer was taking dozens of shots of Rachel's left hand as she and Kyle exchanged rings, creating a permanent record of her wearing stolen property. The videographer was capturing every angle of the ceremony, including close-ups of the ring that would serve as evidence if this case went to trial. Rachel herself was holding her hand in prominent positions throughout the ceremony, showing off my ring to the assembled guests, making sure it was visible in every photo and video. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife and Kyle kissed Rachel for the first time as her husband, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Rice and rose petals flew through the air as the new couple walked back down the aisle, Rachel's stolen ring catching the light with every step. They looked radiant, victorious, like they'd conquered the world together. Rachel waved to the crowd with her left hand extended, making absolutely certain that everyone could see the massive diamond she was wearing. The cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, with guests mingling on the terrace, while servers passed champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I could see Rachel and Kyle making their rounds, accepting congratulations and posing for more photos. Several guests specifically commented on Rachel's ring, and I watched her smile and thank them, never once mentioning that it didn't actually belong to her. She was basking in the attention, loving every moment of being the center of admiration while wearing my stolen property. Detective Williams texted me at 5:47, in position. Arrest will occur in approximately 10 minutes during the transition to the reception hall. Officers are stationed at all exits. Are you prepared for this? I typed back, ready. But I wasn't sure I was really ready for what was about to happen. In 10 minutes, my sister's perfect wedding would become a nightmare. Her new husband would watch his bride get handcuffed and read her rights in front of their family and friends. My parents would see their younger daughter arrested for stealing from their older daughter. The 150 wedding guests would witness a scene they'd probably talk about for years to come. Part of me still wanted to call it off, to text Detective Williams and tell her I'd changed my mind, to let Rachel keep the ring for her honeymoon, and deal with this privately later. The family programming was strong, the lifelong habit of protecting Rachel from consequences, of smoothing over her mistakes, of prioritizing her happiness over my own well-being. But I thought about David's words earlier, about how this was who Rachel really was, and I thought about the text messages she'd sent calling me insane and telling me she hated me for not allowing her to profit from stealing from me. At 5:55, I saw Detective Williams and two uniformed officers approach the cocktail area. They moved casually, professionally, not drawing attention to themselves as they positioned themselves near where Rachel and Kyle
were chatting with a group of college friends. The photographer was still taking candid shots of the couple, capturing Rachel's animated gestures as she told some story that had everyone laughing. My ring sparkled on her finger as she gestured, clearly visible in every frame. Detective Williams approached the group and said something quietly to Rachel. I was too far away to hear the words, but I could see Rachel's face change from confusion to alarm to outright panic as she realized what was happening. Kyle stepped protectively closer to his new wife, his expression bewildered as Detective Williams showed her badge and began explaining the situation. The group of friends backing away slowly, sensing that something serious was unfolding but not understanding what. Rachel began shaking her head violently, her voice rising even though I couldn't make out the words. She was gesturing frantically with both hands, and I could see her pointing in the direction of the parking lot, probably trying to claim that I was somewhere nearby, and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding that could be worked out between sisters. But Detective Williams remained calm and professional, and when she asked Rachel to remove the ring, my sister's defiance became unmistakable even from my distant vantage point. The moment Rachel refused to remove my ring voluntarily, Detective Williams signaled to the uniformed officers. They stepped forward and I watched my sister's perfect wedding day shatter into 1,000 pieces as she was informed that she was under arrest for grand theft. The handcuffs went on while she was still wearing my stolen ring, while she was still in her wedding dress, while her new husband stood frozen in shock and wedding guests began turning to stare at the commotion. Kyle was asking frantic questions that the officers couldn't answer due to privacy laws. My parents were pushing through the crowd with horrified expressions, and Rachel was crying and screaming that this was all a misunderstanding, that I was crazy, that someone needed to call me and make me fix this. But the ring was still on her finger, the evidence was overwhelming, and Detective Williams was reading her rights in a clear, steady voice that carried across the suddenly silent terrace. As they led Rachel away, still in her wedding dress and my stolen ring, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of watching actions meet consequences without my intervention to soften the blow. For once, Rachel's choices had caught up with her without me stepping in to minimize the damage or take responsibility for cleaning up her mess. For once, the person who had been harmed, me, wasn't being asked to prioritize the comfort of the person who had caused the harm. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from family members, from Rachel's friends, from people who had gotten my number from my parents and wanted to know how I could do such a thing to my own sister on her wedding day. I turned the phone to silent and sat in my car watching the aftermath unfold. Wedding guests were standing in confused clusters, some heading to their cars early, others lingering to gossip about what they'd just witnessed. The photographer had stopped taking pictures. The string quartet had packed up their instruments. The fairy tale wedding had become a true crime episode, and everyone present would remember this day for very different reasons than Rachel had intended. 20 minutes later, Detective Williams approached my car. I rolled down the window and she handed me a small evidence bag containing my engagement ring. We had to photograph it as evidence first. But this belongs to you, she said. Your sister was not cooperative during the arrest, but the ring has been recovered undamaged. I held the bag carefully, looking at my ring through the clear plastic. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning when I'd discovered it missing, the diamonds and sapphires still sparkling, the engraving still visible along the band. But everything else had changed completely. This ring would now forever be connected to the day my sister was arrested at her own wedding for stealing it. The family heirloom that was supposed to represent love and commitment and family continuity had become evidence in a criminal case that would likely tear our family apart permanently. What happens next? I asked Detective Williams. She'll be processed and released on bail tonight, probably within a few hours. The district attorney's office will review the case and decide whether to pursue felony charges. Given the value of the ring and the evidence we have, including her text messages admitting to taking it, it's likely they'll proceed with prosecution. I nodded,
understanding that this was far from over. There would be court dates and legal proceedings and probably more family drama than I could imagine. But sitting there with my ring finally back in my possession, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace, not happiness, exactly, because there was nothing happy about any of this. But peace in knowing that I'd finally stopped enabling Rachel's behavior and had insisted on accountability for once in our relationship. The wedding reception was officially canceled, though some family members were gathering in small groups in the parking lot, probably trying to figure out how to proceed. I saw my parents talking intensely with Kyle, who still looked like he was in shock. Rachel's bridesmaids were standing by their cars in their sage green dresses, some crying, all of them on their phones, probably calling their own family members to report on the most dramatic wedding they'd ever attended. I started my car and drove home, my recovered ring sitting safely in the evidence bag on the passenger seat. Tomorrow I would have to deal with the aftermath, with angry family members and complicated legal proceedings and the knowledge that I'd chosen justice over family peace. But tonight, I was going home to David, to my apartment where my belongings were safe from theft, to my life where my boundaries would finally be respected because I'd learned to enforce them myself. The last text I received that evening was from an unknown number, probably Kyle, Jessica. I had no idea the ring wasn't hers. I'm so sorry this happened. Rachel is saying you set her up, but I found the insurance papers in her purse and I can see your name on them. I don't know what to believe anymore. I typed back, I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this. The insurance papers will show you everything you need to know about who really owns that ring. Then I blocked that number too. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, my ring was home where it belonged, and for the first time in my adult life, I'd chosen my own well-being over my family's comfort. It felt like the beginning of something new, something healthier, something that honored my worth instead of sacrificing it to keep other people happy. David was waiting for me when I got home, and when I showed him the evidence bag containing my recovered ring, he pulled me into his arms and held me while I finally let myself cry. Not tears of regret or guilt, but tears of relief that the nightmare was over, and I'd found the courage to stand up for myself when it mattered most. The ring would need to be cleaned again after being evidence in a criminal case, but it was mine again, and I was mine again, and that felt like everything. The morning after Rachel's arrest, I woke up to 37 missed calls and 84 unread text messages. My phone had been buzzing non-stop since 5 in the morning, creating a symphony of notifications that felt like digital warfare. I scrolled through the messages without reading most of them, catching glimpses of words like family destroyer, jealous sister, and wedding ruiner from numbers I didn't recognize. Word had clearly spread beyond our immediate family, probably through social media posts and group chats among the wedding guests who had witnessed the arrest. The most disturbing messages weren't the angry ones from distant relatives or Rachel's friends. Those I could dismiss as people who didn't know the full story, who had only heard Rachel's version where she was the innocent victim of her cruel older sister's jealousy. What bothered me were the messages from people who did know our family history, who had watched Rachel's pattern of irresponsible behavior for years, but were still suggesting that I should have handled this privately, that family loyalty should have trumped my right to recover stolen property. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, who had always been the family mediator, sent a particularly long message that started with Jessica. Honey, I understand you were upset about the ring, but having Rachel arrested at her own wedding was extreme. She's always been impulsive, but she's not a criminal. This is going to follow her for the rest of her life. Couldn't you have waited until after the honeymoon to sort this out? The damage to the family is going to be permanent. I set my phone aside and made coffee in my quiet kitchen, looking out at the morning light streaming through my windows. The contrast between the chaos erupting in my digital life and the peace of my physical space was stark. Here, in my apartment, my belongings were safe. My jewelry box sat on my dresser with my engagement ring properly secured inside it. Nobody was gaslighting me or asking me to prioritize someone else's comfort over my own basic rights. The silence felt like a luxury I'd never fully appreciated before. David arrived an hour later with breakfast tacos and a determined expression. He'd clearly been dealing with his own flood of messages, probably from people who knew we were engaged and wanted to understand what had happened. "My sister called me at 6 this morning," he said, setting the food on my kitchen counter. "Apparently someone posted video of the arrest on Instagram and it's making the rounds. She wanted to know if we were okay." "Are we okay?" I asked, realizing I genuinely wasn't sure. The ring was back. Rachel was facing consequences for her actions, and I'd finally stood up for myself in a meaningful way, but the cost was becoming clearer with every angry message and every relationship that was fracturing along the fault lines of this crisis. "I think we're better than okay," David said, pulling me into his arms. "I think you did something incredibly brave yesterday. Not just calling the police, but following through when your entire family was pressuring you to back down. That took strength I'm not sure I would have had." His words meant more to me than he probably realized. For the past 24 hours, I'd been second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too inflexible, too willing to prioritize principle over peace. But David was right. I had been brave. I'd chosen to protect myself instead of protecting someone who had betrayed me, and that was a kind of courage I'd never shown before. My phone rang, and Detective Williams' name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately, grateful for a conversation that would focus on facts rather than emotions. "Good morning, Jessica. I wanted to update you on the situation. Rachel made bail around midnight, and she's been released pending her court date. The district attorney's office has reviewed the evidence, and they're proceeding with felony theft charges." "What does that mean exactly?" "Given the value of the ring and the evidence we have, she's looking at potential jail time if convicted. The minimum sentence for theft of property worth over $100,000 is 2 years, though first-time offenders often receive probation instead. However, the prosecutor is particularly interested in this case because of the family relationship and the fact that she wore the stolen property at a public event. It shows a level of premeditation and brazenness that they don't see often." I absorbed this information slowly. 2 years in prison seemed impossibly harsh for Rachel, who despite her selfishness and poor judgment had never been in serious legal trouble before. But the crime itself was serious, and the way she'd executed it suggested a level of calculation that went beyond simple impulse or poor decision-making. "There's something else you should know," Detective Williams continued. "Rachel's attorney contacted our office this morning. They're claiming that this was a family misunderstanding, that Rachel believed she had permission to borrow the ring, and that you're using the legal system to settle a personal grudge. They're going to try to paint this as a vindictive sister rather than a legitimate theft case." I felt a familiar surge of anger, the same feeling I'd experienced when Rachel's first response to being caught wasn't apology or remorse, but indignation that I dared to hold her accountable. "Do you think that defense will work?" "Not with the evidence we have. Your text messages show clearly that you never gave permission, and her responses show that she knew she was taking something without asking. The security footage from your apartment building shows her using her key to enter your unit when you weren't home and leaving with something she didn't bring in. Most importantly, her behavior after taking the ring, wearing it publicly at her wedding, and refusing to return it when confronted, shows intent to permanently deprive you of your property. That's the legal definition of theft." After ending the call with Detective Williams, I decided to do something I'd never done before in a family crisis. Instead of immediately calling my parents to try to smooth things over or reaching out to other family members to explain my side, I was going to focus on my own life and let the legal system handle Rachel's situation. The urge to manage everyone else's emotions and fix the family dynamics was strong, but I was beginning to understand that my compulsive need to be the family peacekeeper had enabled Rachel's behavior for years. I opened my laptop and started working on a project that had been waiting for weeks. The boutique hotel downtown had finally approved my proposal for curated guest events, and I needed to create a comprehensive plan for their fall season. It felt good to focus on something positive and creative, something that belonged entirely to my professional life and had nothing to do with family drama or stolen property or court cases. 3 hours later, I was deep in research about wine pairings for autumn-themed dinner events when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see my father standing on my doorstep, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't pounding on the door or shouting like he had the day before Rachel's arrest, he was just standing there quietly, waiting. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Hi Dad, Jessica," he said, and his voice was different too. Subdued, uncertain, lacking the confidence and authority he usually projected. "Can we talk? About what? About Rachel? About what happened yesterday? About how we move forward from here?" I stepped aside and let him into my apartment, but I didn't offer him coffee or try to make him comfortable. I was done automatically catering to other people's emotional needs when they hadn't shown any consideration for mine. We sat in my living room, the space feeling smaller with the weight of everything unsaid between us. "Your mother is devastated," he began, and I almost laughed at how predictable his opening was. Not an apology for how they'd treated me, not acknowledgement of what Rachel had done, but an immediate appeal to my sympathy for someone else's pain. "I'm sure she is," I said neutrally. "Rachel's marriage is probably over before it even started. Kyle is talking about having it annulled. He says he doesn't know who he married, that she lied to him about the ring, that he can't trust anything she says now." I felt genuinely sorry for Kyle, who seemed like a decent person caught in the crossfire of Rachel's poor choices. But I also recognized that my father was telling me this to make me feel guilty, to suggest that Rachel's ruined marriage was somehow my fault, rather than the natural consequence of her own actions. "That's unfortunate," I said, "but it's not my responsibility to protect Rachel from the consequences of stealing from me." My father was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he looked up, his expression was pained, but resigned. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been thinking about it all night, and you're right, what Rachel did was theft, plain and simple. And we've been enablers, haven't we? Your mother and me, we've been cleaning up Rachel's messes for so long that we forgot she was capable of making better choices." His words surprised me. I'd expected more pressure to drop the charges, more appeals to family loyalty, more suggestions that I was being too harsh. I hadn't expected accountability or self-reflection. "Do you remember when Rachel was 16, and she took money from your mother's purse to buy concert tickets?" He continued. "We made you give her your ticket because we said she'd learned her lesson and deserved a second chance, but looking back, all we taught her was that stealing from family would be overlooked if she cried enough, and we pressured the victim to forgive her." I did remember. Rachel had stolen $80 from my mother's wallet, spent it on concert tickets for herself and her boyfriend, and then claimed it was a misunderstanding when she got caught. My parents had decided that since the money was already spent, and Rachel was so sorry, the fair thing to do was make me give up my own ticket, so both daughters could go to the concert. I'd been furious at the time, but I'd been taught that being the older sister meant making sacrifices for family harmony. "That wasn't the only time," I said carefully. "There was the credit card thing when she was in college, the time she forged Mom's signature on those loan documents, the way she borrowed my car and brought it back with a dent she never mentioned." "I know," my father said, and he looked genuinely ashamed. "We always found reasons to excuse her behavior. She was young, she was stressed, she made a mistake, she didn't mean any harm. But she's 28 years old, Jessica. At some point, we have to stop treating her like a child who doesn't understand right from wrong." "So what are you saying?"
I'm saying that your mother and I owe you an apology, a real one. We've spent years asking you to be the responsible one, the understanding one, the one who sacrifices for family peace. We made you carry the emotional labor of managing Rachel's problems while never holding her accountable for creating them. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't helping Rachel either. His apology was more than I'd expected, but it also felt complicated. Part of me was relieved to finally hear acknowledgement of the family dynamics that had shaped my entire relationship with my sister. But another part of me was angry that it had taken Rachel being arrested at her own wedding for my parents to recognize patterns that had been obvious for years. I appreciate you saying that, Dad. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to drop the charges against Rachel. This isn't about punishment or revenge, it's about finally insisting that actions have consequences. I understand, he said, though I could see how much it cost him to say it. Your mother is having a harder time accepting it, but she's starting to see that we can't keep rescuing Rachel from herself. It's just hard to watch your daughter face felony charges. It's hard to watch your daughter steal from her own sister too, I pointed out. Yes, he said quietly. It is. We talked for another hour, and while it wasn't a complete reconciliation, it felt like the beginning of a more honest relationship. My father admitted that he'd always been proud of my independence and responsibility, but he'd also taken it for granted, assuming I would always be strong enough to handle whatever the family needed. He'd never considered that constantly asking me to absorb other people's poor choices might be damaging my own well-being. When he left, he hugged me tightly and said, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even when it was hard. I should have taught Rachel to respect your boundaries instead of teaching you to ignore them." That afternoon, I received a call from an unexpected source. Kyle's voice was hesitant when I answered, clearly unsure how to navigate this conversation. "Jessica, I hope it's okay that I'm calling you. I got your number from the police report. I wanted to apologize and to ask you some questions, if that's all right." "Of course. I'm sorry you're caught up in all this." "I had no idea about the ring," he said immediately. "Rachel told me it was a family heirloom that your grandmother had given to her. She said it had been reset for her engagement, and she showed me some old photos that looked like the same diamonds. I never questioned it because why would I? Who lies about something like that?" I felt genuinely sorry for Kyle. He'd married someone under false pretenses, and now he was discovering that his new wife was capable of elaborate deceptions that involved stealing from her own family. "The diamonds are from our grandmother's ring, but my mother gave the original ring to me years ago. Rachel knew that. I found the insurance papers in her purse after the arrest," Kyle continued. "Your name is on everything. The appraisal, the purchase receipt for the setting, the insurance policy, it's all in your name. She's been lying to me about this for months. I'm sorry, I know this must be incredibly difficult." "The thing is," Kyle said, and his voice was getting stronger, more certain, "I keep thinking about what else she might have lied about. We've been together for 2 years, and I thought I knew her. But someone who can steal a $100,000 ring from her own sister and then wear it at her wedding while lying to her new husband about where it came from, that's not someone I actually know at all." Kyle was processing the same realization I'd had over the past few days, that Rachel's behavior wasn't just about the ring. It was about a fundamental disregard for other people's rights and feelings, a willingness to take what she wanted regardless of who got hurt, and a talent for manipulation that allowed her to present herself as the victim even when she was clearly the perpetrator. "Are you really going to have the marriage annulled?" I asked. "I think so. My lawyer says that fraud is grounds for annulment, and lying about stolen property definitely qualifies as fraud. I can't build a marriage on lies, and I can't trust someone who would steal from family. If she'd do that to you, what would she eventually do to me?" Kyle's decision made sense, but it also meant that Rachel's consequences were multiplying. She wasn't just facing criminal charges for the theft, she was losing her marriage, probably her job once the arrest became public knowledge, and most of her family relationships. The price of wearing my stolen ring at her wedding was turning out to be everything she'd thought she was celebrating.
That evening, I finally turned my phone back on and read through some of the messages I'd been avoiding. Most were exactly what I'd expected: family members and family friends expressing shock and disappointment that I'd had Rachel arrested, suggestions that I was being vindictive or jealous, and pleas for me to drop the charges in the interest of family unity. But there were also messages I hadn't anticipated. Several cousins and family friends had reached out privately to say they supported my decision, that they'd watched Rachel get away with inappropriate behavior for years, and that it was about time someone held her accountable. My college roommate sent a long message about her own experience with a sister who stole from family, and how setting boundaries had ultimately improved their relationship. Even some of Rachel's former friends were messaging to say they weren't surprised by what had happened. The message that surprised me most was from my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Helen, who was 92 years old and rarely got involved in family drama. "Dear Jessica," she'd written in her careful handwriting that someone had obviously helped her text, "I heard about what happened with the ring. I want you to know that your grandmother would be proud of you for protecting her diamonds and standing up for yourself. Family means caring for each other, not stealing from each other. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for expecting basic decency. Love, Aunt Helen." I sat in my kitchen reading that message over and over, feeling like I'd received permission from the family matriarch to trust my own judgment. Aunt Helen had known our grandmother better than anyone, and if she thought my grandmother would approve of my choices, then maybe I was on the right path after all. The next morning brought news that the story had made it into the local papers. A friend sent me a link to an article in the Austin American-Statesman with the headline "Bride Arrested at Wedding for Wearing Stolen Ring." The article was brief and stuck to the facts, but it was surreal to see my family's private crisis transformed into public news. The article mentioned that the ring was worth over $100,000 and contained family heirloom diamonds, and that the bride had been arrested during her wedding reception for grand theft. Within hours, the story had been picked up by other news outlets, and by the afternoon it was trending on social media with hashtags like #weddingdrama and #stolenring. People were commenting with their own family drama stories, debating whether I'd been right to call the police, and analyzing Rachel's behavior from every possible angle. Some comments were supportive, praising me for standing up to family manipulation and refusing to enable theft. Others were critical, suggesting that family problems should be handled privately and that I'd been cruel to ruin Rachel's wedding day. The viral nature of the story added another layer of consequence that neither Rachel nor I had anticipated. This wasn't just a private family matter anymore, it was public entertainment, and Rachel's humiliation was being broadcast to strangers across the internet. I felt conflicted about this development. While I was glad that people were seeing the facts of what had happened, rather than just Rachel's version of events, I hadn't intended to publicly shame her. I'd simply wanted my stolen property returned and accountability for the theft. But as I read through the comments and articles, I began to see that my story was resonating with people who had their own experiences with family members who stole, manipulated, or violated boundaries without consequences. Message after message described similar situations: siblings who took money, parents who guilt-tripped their children into accepting abuse, family members who expected forgiveness without accountability. My decision to choose justice over family peace was apparently more common and more necessary than I'd realized. That afternoon, Detective Williams called with another update. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you next week to go over your testimony for the preliminary hearing. Rachel's attorney is pushing for a plea deal, but the DA's office is reluctant to offer anything less than felony charges, given the value of the property and the public nature of the case." What kind of plea deal? Probably restitution and probation in exchange for a guilty plea to a lesser charge, but given that the ring was returned undamaged, and this is her first offense, she'd likely avoid jail time either way. The real consequences are going to be the felony
conviction on her record and the civil implications. Civil implications: she's probably going to face a lawsuit from Kyle's family for the costs of the wedding, since the reception was canceled due to her arrest.
Between the venue fees, catering costs, flowers, photography, and guest travel expenses, that could easily be $50,000 or more. And if Kyle proceeds with the annulment based on fraud, she might have to return wedding gifts or pay for his legal fees. The financial consequences were adding up to far more than the value of my ring. Rachel's decision to steal from me and flaunt it publicly was going to cost her possibly $100,000 or more in legal fees, restitution, and civil judgments. She'd essentially destroyed her own life to wear my ring for a few hours at a wedding that had ended in her arrest. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at my engagement ring sitting safely in its proper place in my jewelry box. It looked exactly the same as it had before Rachel stole it, but everything around it had changed. My relationship with my family was fundamentally different. My understanding of my own boundaries and my willingness to enforce them had evolved, and my sense of my own worth had shifted from someone who absorbed other people's poor choices to someone who insisted on basic respect and accountability. The ring still represented love and commitment and family history, but now it also represented something else: my refusal to sacrifice my own well-being to protect someone who had chosen to harm me. It was a symbol of the moment I'd finally chosen myself over family peace, and despite all the chaos and pain that choice had created, I knew it was the right one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process continued, but tonight I was at peace with my decision to finally stop enabling someone who had mistaken my kindness for weakness, and my love for an invitation to take whatever she wanted. 6 months after Rachel's arrest, I was standing in the ballroom of the Driscoll Hotel, watching my team execute the most successful event I'd ever planned. The autumn wine tasting evening I'd designed for the boutique hotel had sold out within hours of being announced, and now 200 guests were sampling rare vintages while enjoying live jazz and artisanal appetizers in a setting that looked like something from a luxury magazine. The success felt surreal, not just because of the professional milestone it represented, but because it had grown directly from the period when my family life had imploded and I'd finally learned to prioritize my own goals over other people's drama. The legal proceedings had concluded 3 weeks earlier, with Rachel accepting a plea deal that included 2 years of probation, community service, and a felony conviction on her record. She'd avoided jail time, but the consequences had been severe in other ways. Kyle had indeed proceeded with the annulment, citing fraud and irreconcilable differences, and the legal fees alone had cost her nearly $30,000. The civil lawsuit from Kyle's family for wedding expenses had been settled out of court for an amount that Rachel's attorney had described as substantial, though the exact figure was sealed by a confidentiality agreement. More significantly, the viral nature of the story had followed Rachel into every aspect of her life. Her employer, a high-end retail chain that valued their reputation for integrity, had terminated her employment after the arrest became public knowledge. Potential new employers routinely found the news articles when they searched her name online, making it nearly impossible for her to find work in her field. She'd eventually taken a job at a small boutique in a different city, starting over with a new name and hoping that distance and time would eventually allow her to escape the consequences of her choices. Throughout the legal process, I'd maintained my boundaries with remarkable consistency, something that surprised even me. When Rachel's attorney had approached me about testifying on her behalf during sentencing, describing her remorse and asking me to speak about her character, I'd politely declined. When my mother had called crying and begging me to write a letter to the judge asking for leniency, I'd explained that I wouldn't interfere with the legal process in either direction. When distant relatives had suggested family counseling or mediation to heal the rift, I'd made it clear that my relationship with Rachel was permanently altered, and that I wasn't interested in rebuilding something that had never been healthy to begin with. The most difficult conversation had been with Rachel herself, who had called me 2 months after her arrest. I'd almost declined the call, but curiosity and perhaps some lingering hope for genuine accountability had made me answer. Her voice had been different, smaller, somehow lacking the confidence and entitlement that had characterized her behavior for so many years. "Jessica," she'd said, "I want to apologize. Really apologize, not the fake kind where I'm just trying to get out of trouble. I'd waited, saying nothing, learning that silence could be a powerful tool for encouraging honesty. I've been thinking about why I took your ring, and I think it was about more than just wanting something pretty for my wedding photos. I think I was angry that you had something so valuable, something that represented the kind of life I wanted but couldn't afford. You've always been the responsible one, the one who saves money and makes smart choices, and I've always been the mess that everyone has to clean up after. Taking your ring felt like evening the score somehow, like taking something from someone who had more than me. Her words had been more honest than anything she'd ever said to me, but they'd also revealed the depth of resentment she'd been carrying for years. She hadn't just stolen my ring impulsively, she'd stolen it because she felt entitled to what I'd worked for, because she believed that my success somehow diminished her opportunities, because she thought that family meant having access to whatever she wanted regardless of who actually owned it. I understand that you were angry, I'd said carefully. But understanding your motivation doesn't change what you did or make it acceptable. I know I destroyed everything. My marriage, my job, my relationship with you and mom and dad. Kyle won't even speak to me anymore. He says he doesn't know who he married. And honestly, I don't blame him. I lied to him about so many things, not just the ring. What kinds of things? Money stuff mostly. I told him my student loans were smaller than they really are. I hid credit card debt. I borrowed money from his parents under false pretenses and used it for personal stuff instead of what I said it was for. The ring was just the biggest lie, but it wasn't the only one. This revelation had been disturbing but not entirely surprising. Someone who would steal a family heirloom and wear it at their own wedding while lying to their new spouse about its origin was clearly capable of other forms of deception. Rachel's entire relationship with Kyle had apparently been built on a foundation of financial dishonesty, and the ring theft had simply been the moment when her pattern of lies had become impossible to maintain. "Are you getting help?" I'd asked. "Therapy, financial counseling, anything like that?" "Yeah, my probation officer required it. I'm seeing a therapist who specializes in impulse control and family dysfunction. It's hard talking about why I always felt like I deserved things I didn't earn, why I thought family meant never having to respect boundaries. But I'm starting to understand how messed up my thinking was." The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, and by the end I'd felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not enough to forgive or forget, not enough to rebuild our relationship, but genuine sadness for someone who had destroyed her own life through a series of increasingly poor choices. Rachel was facing consequences that would follow her for years, possibly decades, and while those consequences were appropriate and necessary, they were also tragic. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Rachel had said before ending the call. "I know I burned that bridge completely. But I want you to know that I understand now why you called the police, why you didn't drop the charges, why you chose yourself over protecting me. You were right to do it. I needed to face consequences, and everyone in our family needed to see that you weren't going to be the family doormat anymore." That conversation had been the last direct communication between us, and I'd found peace with that reality. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, especially when they'd been fundamentally unbalanced from the beginning. Rachel and I had never been equals. I'd always been the giver, and she'd always been the taker, and her theft of my ring had simply been the most extreme example of a dynamic that had defined our entire relationship. My relationship with my parents had evolved more positively, though it had required extensive conversation and boundary setting that was still ongoing. My father had continued to show genuine remorse for the years of enabling behavior, and he'd begun attending therapy to understand his own role in the family dysfunction. My mother had been slower to accept accountability, initially focusing on her grief over Rachel's ruined life rather than examining the parenting choices that had contributed to it. The breakthrough with my mother had come during a particularly honest conversation about family patterns and expectations. I'd finally been able to explain how exhausting it had been to constantly absorb other people's poor choices, to be expected to sacrifice my own well-being for family peace, to watch Rachel receive sympathy and support for behavior that would have been unacceptable from anyone else. My mother had initially defended their parenting by saying they just wanted both daughters to be happy, but I'd pointed out that their approach had made Rachel chronically irresponsible while making me chronically responsible for problems I didn't create. We taught Rachel that someone would always clean up her messes, I'd said during one particularly difficult conversation, and we taught me that my job was to be that someone. That's not love, Mom, that's dysfunction. Slowly, painfully, my mother had begun to understand that their attempts to protect Rachel from consequences had actually harmed both of their daughters. Rachel had never learned to be accountable for her choices, and I had never learned that my worth wasn't dependent on my utility to other people. The ring theft had simply been the moment when this family system had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Now, watching my successful event unfold in the elegant ballroom, I felt the satisfaction of having built something entirely my own. The boutique hotel had been so impressed with the autumn wine tasting that they'd offered me a contract to design their entire social calendar for the following year. Other venues had reached out after seeing the press coverage of the event, and I was beginning to build a reputation as someone who could create sophisticated, memorable experiences that attracted affluent clientele. David moved through the crowd with easy confidence, charming the hotel executives and potential clients who had attended to see my work. He'd been incredible throughout the entire ordeal, with Rachel supporting my decisions without trying to influence them, providing emotional stability without trying to fix everything himself. Watching him network on my behalf while I focused on the operational details reminded me why we worked so well together. We were both independent people who chose to build something together rather than people who needed each other to feel complete. The ring on my finger caught the light as I adjusted a floral arrangement, and I smiled at how different it looked now compared to 6 months ago. It was the same ring, the same diamonds and sapphires and platinum setting, but it represented something entirely different. Before Rachel's theft, it had symbolized love and commitment and family history. Now it also represented my refusal to be victimized, my insistence on accountability, my willingness to choose justice over convenience. Amanda Foster, my best friend who had become my unofficial business partner for large events, appeared at my elbow with a champagne flute and a satisfied expression. The hotel manager just told me that 3 other venues want to book you for their spring events, she said quietly. This is officially a career-launching evening. I accepted the champagne and looked around the ballroom, taking in the scene of sophisticated adults enjoying an evening I'd designed from start to finish. The success felt earned in a way that previous achievements hadn't, because it had grown from a period when I'd finally learned to prioritize my own goals over other people's emergencies. The months of family chaos following Rachel's arrest had actually been some of the most productive of my professional life, because I'd stopped dropping everything to manage other people's emotional crises. There's something else, Amanda continued, lowering her voice. I saw the guest list for next month's charity auction at the country club. Rachel's name isn't on it anymore. Apparently her arrest made her persona non grata in those social circles. Kyle's family has a lot of influence, and word has gotten around about what she did. This information didn't surprise me, but it added another layer to the consequences Rachel was facing. Austin's social scene was smaller and more interconnected than many people realized, and the story of someone stealing from family and lying to their spouse had clearly damaged her reputation beyond repair. She wouldn't just be starting over professionally, she'd be starting over socially as well, probably in a different city where people didn't know her history. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave with glowing reviews and business cards, I found myself standing alone for a moment in the hotel's elegant lobby. The contrast between this moment and the morning I'd discovered my ring missing was almost overwhelming. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman who absorbed other people's problems and prioritized family peace over her own well-being. Tonight, I was a successful event planner who had learned to set boundaries and build a life that honored her own worth. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and for a moment I wondered if it might be Rachel reaching out again. Instead, it was from Kyle. Jessica, I saw the article about your event in the paper. Congratulations on your success. I wanted you to know that the annulment was finalized last week, and I'm doing well. Thank you for helping me see who Rachel really was before I wasted more years with someone who didn't respect truth or boundaries. I hope you're happy. Kyle's message reminded me that my decision to prosecute Rachel hadn't just protected me, it had protected him too. If I'd chosen to handle the theft privately, if I'd allowed family pressure to convince me to drop the charges, Kyle might have spent years in a marriage with someone who was fundamentally dishonest about money and property and family relationships. My refusal to enable Rachel's behavior had given him information he needed to make informed decisions about his own life. David found me in the lobby as the hotel staff began cleaning up the ballroom, ready to go home. He asked, and I realized that home had taken on a different meaning over the past 6 months. It wasn't just my apartment or the physical space where I felt safe. It was the life I'd built where my boundaries were respected, where my achievements were celebrated, where my worth wasn't dependent on my willingness to absorb other people's poor choices. More than ready, I said, taking his hand as we walked toward the parking garage. During the drive home, David said something that captured exactly how I'd been feeling. You know what I've been thinking about lately, how stealing your ring was probably the worst mistake Rachel ever made, but not for the reasons she thinks. It wasn't just that she got arrested or lost her marriage or faced legal consequences, it was that she finally pushed you far enough to discover your own strength. She created the exact person she couldn't manipulate anymore. He was right. Rachel's theft hadn't just cost her everything she'd thought she was celebrating, it had transformed me into someone who couldn't be victimized the same way again. I'd learned that I could survive family disapproval, that I could choose justice over peace, that I could build a successful life without constantly managing other people's emotional needs. Rachel had unknowingly freed me from the family role that had been limiting my growth for years. Back in my apartment, I followed my new evening routine of securing my engagement ring in its proper place in my jewelry box. The simple act had become symbolic of my commitment to protecting what belonged to me both literally and metaphorically. My property, my time, my energy, my emotional well-being all belonged to me first, and I would share them with people who respected that ownership rather than people who felt entitled to take whatever they wanted. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, someone who would have been devastated by family conflict, who would have prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own rights, who would have found a way to blame herself for someone else's criminal behavior. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered fondly but could never be again. The woman I'd become was stronger, clearer about her boundaries, more successful professionally, and more at peace with the reality that some relationships couldn't be saved or shouldn't be preserved. She was someone who understood that love didn't mean accepting abuse, that family didn't mean tolerating theft, and that forgiveness didn't require sacrificing justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new events to plan and boundaries to maintain and relationships to nurture with people who respected what I brought to their lives. But tonight I fell asleep in my safe apartment with my recovered ring in its proper place, surrounded by the life I'd built through my own choices rather than my willingness to absorb everyone else's. The ring still contained my grandmother's diamonds, still represented 4 generations of family history, still symbolized love and commitment and the promise of a future with David. But now it also represented something else, the moment I'd chosen to protect what belonged to me instead of sacrificing it to keep others comfortable. It was a reminder that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even when that refusal comes at a tremendous personal cost. Rachel's theft had been intended to steal more than just a piece of jewelry. It had been an attempt to take my special moment, my symbol of love, my family heritage, and my sense of security in my own home. But ultimately her crime had given me something far more valuable than what she'd tried to take: the knowledge that I was strong enough to stand up for myself when it mattered most, even when everyone I loved was asking me to stand down. 6 months later I was living proof that choosing yourself over dysfunction isn't selfish, it's necessary, that protecting your boundaries isn't cruel, it's healthy. And that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who keeps making terrible choices is to finally let them face the consequences without rushing in to soften the blow. My ring was back where it belonged, my life was better than it had ever been, and I was finally truly free. 1 year after the arrest that changed everything, I found myself standing in the courthouse where Rachel's case had been finalized, but this time for an entirely different reason. David and I were here to apply for our marriage license, a moment that should have been purely joyful but carried the weight of everything that had happened since my ring was first stolen. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were planning our wedding in the same building where my sister had faced criminal charges for trying to steal the symbol of our engagement. The courthouse clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, processed our paperwork with professional courtesy. When she asked for identification and noticed my name, her expression shifted slightly with recognition. "You're the woman from that wedding arrest story," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "I remember reading about it in the paper. That was your sister who took your ring." I nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of embarrassment and vindication that came whenever strangers recognized me from the media coverage. The story had taken on a life of its own over the past year, becoming one of those viral tales that people shared as cautionary stories about family dysfunction and the importance of boundaries. True crime podcasters had covered it, relationship advice columnists had analyzed it, and social media influencers had used it as an example of how family loyalty shouldn't override personal rights. "Well, good for you for standing up for yourself," the clerk continued, stamping our documents with decisive authority. "Too many people let family members walk all over them. Sometimes you have to draw a line, even when it hurts." Her words of support meant more than she probably realized. Over the past year, I'd received thousands of messages from strangers who had found strength in my story to address their own family dysfunction, to set boundaries with manipulative relatives, to choose their own well-being over keeping the peace. What had started as a personal crisis had apparently resonated with people facing similar situations, and knowing that my painful experience had helped others find their own courage made the whole ordeal feel meaningful in ways I'd never expected. David squeezed my hand as we left the courthouse, both of us carrying copies of our marriage license, and the weight of how different this moment felt compared to what it might have been a year ago. If Rachel hadn't stolen my ring, if the arrest hadn't happened, if our family hadn't imploded in such a public and dramatic way, we might be planning a traditional wedding with all the extended family dynamics and complicated relationships that had defined my life for so long. Instead, we were planning an intimate ceremony with only the people who had supported us through the chaos, who had respected our boundaries, who had chosen to see the situation clearly rather than demanding that I sacrifice my rights for family peace. The guest list was smaller but infinitely more meaningful, composed entirely of people who genuinely celebrated our happiness rather than people who felt obligated to attend out of family duty. My relationship with my parents had continued to evolve throughout the year, though it looked nothing like what it had been before. My father had made genuine progress in therapy, learning to recognize the enabling patterns that had shaped our family for decades. He'd started having individual conversations with me about my childhood experiences, asking questions about moments when I'd felt unsupported or pressured to accommodate Rachel's behavior. These conversations were often difficult, but they felt like the foundation of a more honest relationship. My mother's journey had been more complicated. She'd initially focused on her grief over losing Rachel from her life, treating my sister's exile from the family as a tragedy that had befallen us rather than a consequence Rachel had chosen through her own actions. It had taken months of family therapy sessions for my mother to begin examining her own role in creating the family dynamics that had made Rachel's theft seem almost inevitable. The breakthrough had come during a particularly intense therapy session where our counselor had asked my mother to describe what she thought would have happened if I had never called the police, if I'd simply demanded the ring back privately and tried to handle everything within the family. As my mother worked through that hypothetical scenario, describing how she would have pressured me to forgive Rachel, how she would have asked me to keep the incident secret to protect Rachel's marriage, how she would have expected me to accept partial repayment over time rather than insisting on full accountability, she'd begun to see the pattern. "I would have asked you to absorb the consequences of her choices again," my mother had said slowly, her voice heavy with realization. Just like I always did, I would have made it your responsibility to manage her behavior and protect her from getting in trouble. That moment of clarity had marked the beginning of a different relationship between us, one where my mother could acknowledge that her protective instincts toward Rachel had often come at my expense. She'd started making conscious efforts to support my decisions without trying to manage my emotions or suggest alternative approaches that might be easier for everyone else to handle. The most surprising relationship development had been with my extended family. Several cousins and aunts who had initially criticized my decision to involve law enforcement had reached out over the months to apologize and share their own stories of family members who had taken advantage of others without consequences. My cousin Maria had told me about her brother who had stolen money from their grandmother's purse for years before anyone confronted him. My Aunt Susan had described her daughter's pattern of borrowing money and never paying it back, and how the family's reluctance to address it directly had enabled increasingly serious financial irresponsibility. These conversations had revealed that Rachel's behavior wasn't unique in our family, and neither was the pattern of expecting victims to prioritize family peace over their own rights. My decision to break that cycle had apparently given other family members permission to examine their own situations more honestly, and several of them had started setting boundaries with relatives who had been taking advantage of their generosity for years. The most dramatic change had been in my professional life, where the confidence I'd gained from standing up to family manipulation had translated into unprecedented success. The boutique hotel contract had led to partnerships with 3 other luxury venues, and I'd recently been featured in a regional magazine as one of Austin's most innovative event planners. The article had mentioned the viral wedding arrest story, framing it as an example of how personal strength could translate into professional achievement. More importantly, the way I conducted business had fundamentally changed. I no longer undercharged for my services or accepted unreasonable demands from difficult clients. I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and respond to them with clear boundaries rather than accommodation. When a potential client tried to pressure me into reducing my prices by claiming budget constraints while simultaneously describing elaborate upgrade requests, I politely declined the project rather than trying to make it work by sacrificing my own profit margins. This new approach had actually increased demand for my services rather than reducing it. Clients seemed to respect someone who valued their own work appropriately, and
My reputation for delivering exceptional results without tolerating unprofessional behavior had made me the preferred planner for high-end events, where quality mattered more than cost savings. Amanda Foster had become my official business partner 6 months earlier, and together we'd built something that felt sustainable and empowering rather than exhausting. We'd learned to support each other's boundaries, to share responsibilities equitably, and to celebrate successes without the underlying anxiety that had characterized my previous approach to achievement. Working with someone who respected my worth and contributed equally to our shared goals had shown me what healthy partnership looked like in all areas of life. The legal aftermath of Rachel's case had finally concluded 2 months earlier with the completion of her community service hours and the final civil settlements. Kyle had remarried in a small ceremony in Colorado, where he'd moved to start fresh after the annulment. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd heard that he was happy and had found someone who shared his values about honesty and financial responsibility. His new wife apparently knew the whole story about Rachel and had expressed gratitude that the truth had come out before Kyle had wasted more years in a marriage built on deception. Rachel herself had moved to Portland and was working as a sales associate at a small jewelry store, a choice that struck me as either deeply ironic or genuinely therapeutic. According to my mother, who maintained minimal contact with her, Rachel was in intensive therapy and had been sober from alcohol for 8 months. The theft and its consequences had apparently forced her to confront not just her financial irresponsibility, but a broader pattern of using substances and impulsive behavior to avoid dealing with difficult emotions. I felt genuinely glad that Rachel was getting help and making positive changes, but I also maintained my decision to have no direct contact with her. Some relationships couldn't be repaired, especially when they'd been fundamentally unequal from the beginning.
Rachel's theft of my ring had simply been the most extreme example of a dynamic where she took what she wanted and expected me to manage the emotional aftermath. The ring itself had become something different over the past year, transformed from a simple symbol of engagement into a representation of personal strength and the importance of protecting what belonged to me. I wore it daily now, not just as a sign of my commitment to David, but as a reminder that I was worth defending, that my boundaries mattered, that my rights deserved protection even when enforcing them caused discomfort for other people. David had suggested several times that we could replace the ring if the associations with Rachel's theft made it difficult to wear, but I'd always declined. This ring, with its complicated history and hard-won recovery, felt more meaningful than a replacement ever could. It represented not just David's love and our future together, but my own journey from someone who absorbed other people's poor choices to someone who insisted on accountability and respect. Our wedding planning had reflected this new understanding of what mattered most. Instead of a large traditional ceremony with all the family drama and complicated relationships that had defined my previous life, we were planning an intimate celebration with 30 guests at a historic inn outside the city. The guest list included only people who had supported us through the difficult year, who had respected our decisions even when they were painful, who had chosen to see the situation clearly, rather than asking us to minimize our experiences for everyone else's comfort. My parents would be there, but not in the traditional roles of wedding planners or major decision-makers. They were invited as guests who were important to us, but the planning and execution belonged entirely to David and me. This boundary had been difficult for my mother to accept initially, as she'd always imagined being deeply involved in planning her daughter's weddings, but she'd eventually come to understand that our approach reflected the healthier relationship dynamics we'd worked so hard to build. The most meaningful aspect of our wedding planning had been the complete absence of drama or manipulation. No one was threatening to boycott if they didn't approve of our choices. No one was demanding special accommodations that would compromise our vision. No one was using emotional manipulation to try to influence our decisions. The planning process had been joyful and collaborative, focused entirely on celebrating our relationship rather than managing other people's expectations or emotional needs. 3 weeks before our wedding, I received an unexpected piece of mail that brought the entire experience full circle. It was a letter from Rachel, the first direct communication we'd had since her phone call months earlier. The envelope was addressed in her familiar handwriting, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that was brief but clearly genuine. "Jessica," it read, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. I wanted you to know that I've been sober for 8 months and in therapy for a year, and I'm finally starting to understand the person I was when I stole your ring. I was entitled, selfish, and completely incapable of respecting other people's boundaries. I thought family meant having access to whatever I wanted, and I thought your success somehow diminished my own opportunities. I was wrong about everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness or a relationship or anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you called the police, why you didn't drop the charges, why you chose yourself over protecting me from consequences. You were right to do it. I needed to face what I'd done, and our family needed to see that you weren't going to be everyone's emotional support system anymore. I hope you're happy. I hope your wedding is beautiful. I hope you never have to deal with anyone like the person I used to be ever again." Rachel, the letter affected me more than I'd expected. Not because it changed anything about my decision to maintain no contact, but because it confirmed that my choice to enforce consequences had ultimately helped Rachel grow into someone capable of genuine accountability. The therapy and sobriety work she'd done over the past year had apparently given her the tools to see her behavior clearly and take responsibility for it without deflecting or making excuses. I showed the letter to David, who read it thoughtfully before offering his perspective. "It sounds like she's finally becoming the person she could have been all along if your family had insisted on accountability years ago," he said. "It's good that she's growing, but it doesn't change the fact that she had to steal from you and destroy her own life before she was willing to do the work." He was right. Rachel's growth was meaningful, and I was genuinely glad for her progress, but it also highlighted how unnecessary all the pain and destruction had been. If our family had insisted on consequences for her smaller violations years earlier, if they'd refused to enable her irresponsible behavior, if they'd supported my boundaries instead of asking me to constantly accommodate her poor choices, none of the dramatic events of the past year would have been necessary. The letter also reminded me of how much I'd changed over the past year. The woman who had discovered her stolen ring 12 months ago would have been devastated by family conflict, desperate to find a way to rebuild the relationship, willing to accept minimal accountability if it meant restoring family harmony. The woman reading Rachel's letter now felt mostly neutral about its contents, glad for her growth but uninterested in resuming a relationship that had never been healthy. Our wedding day arrived with perfect October weather and none of the anxiety that often accompanies major family events. The historic inn was beautiful in its autumn setting. The 30 guests were people who genuinely celebrated our happiness, and the ceremony felt like a true reflection of the relationship David and I had built together. My parents were present but not overwhelming, supportive but not controlling, happy for us without trying to make the day about their own emotions or needs. During the reception, my father approached me while I was talking with some of David's colleagues, asking if he could have a private moment. We walked to a quiet corner of the garden, and he looked at me with an expression that was proud and slightly sad at the same time. "I've been thinking about this day for months," he said, "trying to figure out what I wanted to say to you. A year ago, I would have given you advice about marriage, about family, about managing relationships. But I've learned that you don't need my advice anymore. You've figured out how to build healthy relationships, how to set boundaries, how to choose people who respect what you bring to their lives. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see that our family patterns were holding you back." His words felt like a completion of the journey we'd been on together over the past year, a recognition that our relationship had evolved from one where he gave guidance to one where we related as adults who respected each other's autonomy. The wedding felt like a celebration not just of my marriage to David, but of the healthier version of myself I'd discovered through the process of finally insisting that my rights and boundaries mattered. As David and I danced to our first song as a married couple, I looked around at the faces of people who had supported us through the most difficult year of our relationship, who had respected our decisions even when they were painful, who had chosen to celebrate our happiness rather than focusing on the family drama that had preceded it. The contrast between this intimate, genuine celebration and the performative spectacle that Rachel's wedding had been couldn't have been more stark. My engagement ring caught the light as we moved together, the diamonds and sapphires sparkling exactly as they had on the day David had proposed, but now representing so much more than just our commitment to each other. They represented my refusal to be victimized, my insistence on accountability, my willingness to choose justice over convenience, and my discovery that I was worth protecting even when that protection required difficult choices. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, David handed me a small wrapped box that he said was a wedding gift, separate from the ones we'd opened earlier. Inside was a delicate platinum bracelet with a small engraved charm that read "Worth Protecting." The inscription was simple but perfect, capturing everything I'd learned about my own value over the past year. "I wanted you to have something that reminds you of your strength," he said as he fastened the bracelet around my wrist. "Not just the strength to stand up to your family, but the strength to build something new when the old patterns weren't working anymore." The bracelet joined my engagement ring as a symbol of transformation, of the journey from someone who absorbed other people's poor choices to someone who insisted on respect and reciprocity in all relationships. Together, they represented the most important lesson I'd learned, that loving yourself enough to enforce boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary, and that sometimes the most caring thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst behavior, even when that refusal comes at a tremendous personal cost. Our honeymoon was blissfully drama-free, spent in a small coastal town where nobody knew our story and we could simply enjoy being newlyweds without managing anyone else's emotions or expectations.
For 2 weeks, we walked on beaches, read books, planned our future, and celebrated the life we'd built together without any interference from people who thought they knew better than we did about what would make us happy. When we returned home, I found myself looking forward to the future with an excitement I'd never experienced before. Not because external circumstances were perfect, but because I'd finally learned to create circumstances that honored my own worth and supported my own goals. The ring on my finger, the bracelet on my wrist, and the marriage certificate in our filing cabinet all represented the same truth. I was worth protecting, worth celebrating, worth building a life around, and I would never again sacrifice those truths to keep other people comfortable. Rachel's theft had been intended to steal more than just jewelry. It had been an attempt to take my joy, my security, my family heritage, and my faith in the people I loved most. But ultimately, her crime had given me something far more valuable than what she'd tried to take: the knowledge that I was strong enough to stand up for myself when it mattered most, wise enough to choose healthy relationships over familiar dysfunction, and worthy of a life built on respect rather than accommodation. The woman who had discovered her stolen ring 15 months ago felt like someone I remembered fondly but could never be again. The woman wearing that recovered ring as a married person was stronger, clearer about her boundaries, more successful professionally, and more at peace with the reality that some relationships couldn't and shouldn't be preserved at any cost. My ring was back where it belonged, my life was better than it had ever been, and I was finally completely free to build the future I actually wanted rather than the one everyone else thought I should accept. 2 years had passed since the courthouse ceremony that transformed everything, and I was sitting in my new office overlooking downtown Austin, reviewing contracts for what would become the largest event planning company in Central Texas. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline that still took my breath away, a daily reminder of how far I'd traveled from the woman who once prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own success. The business that had grown from my decision to finally protect my boundaries had expanded beyond anything I'd imagined possible, with a team of 12 employees and a waiting list of clients that stretched 6 months into the future. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rachel's attempt to steal my moment of happiness had ultimately launched me into the most fulfilling period of my life. The publicity from the arrest, while initially embarrassing, had established my reputation as someone who wouldn't compromise on integrity or accountability. Clients sought me out specifically because they'd heard I was someone who delivered exceptional results while maintaining clear professional boundaries, and that combination had proven to be exactly what Austin's luxury event market had been missing. Amanda knocked on my office door, carrying the morning mail and wearing the satisfied expression that usually meant good news. As my business partner and closest friend, she'd witnessed every stage of my transformation from conflict-avoidant people-pleaser to confident entrepreneur. Her support during the darkest moments of family chaos had been invaluable, but more importantly, she'd helped me learn to celebrate success without the underlying guilt that had once accompanied every achievement. The Riverside Resort contract came through, she announced, setting a thick envelope on my desk. They want us to handle their entire wedding season next year. That's 43 weddings, plus all their corporate events and private parties. We're going to need to hire at least 6 more people. The Riverside Resort was the most prestigious venue in the region, known for hosting celebrity weddings and high-profile corporate events. Landing their exclusive contract represented a level of professional recognition that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. But more than the prestige, it represented the security and independence that came from building something entirely my own, without depending on family connections or tolerating disrespectful behavior from anyone. David appeared in the doorway behind Amanda, carrying coffee and pastries from the bakery downstairs. As my husband and unofficial business advisor, he'd learned to navigate the delicate balance between supporting my work and maintaining our personal relationship boundaries. His marketing expertise had been crucial in growing the business, but he'd been careful to contribute as a partner rather than trying to take control or make decisions for me. How does it feel to officially be Austin's premier event planning firm?
he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk, with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in every aspect of my life. Surreal, I admitted, looking at the contract that would solidify our company's position as the market leader. 2 years ago, I was planning one event at a time, and constantly second-guessing whether I was charging enough or asking for too much. Now we're booked solid and turning away clients because we can't accommodate everyone who wants to work with us. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but each month had brought new opportunities that built on the foundation of self-respect I'd established by refusing to tolerate Rachel's theft. Learning to value my own work appropriately had attracted clients who respected quality and professionalism. Setting clear boundaries with difficult customers had earned referrals from satisfied clients who appreciated working with someone who wouldn't compromise standards for the sake of avoiding conflict. Amanda pulled out her phone to show me the latest review that had appeared on our company website. Listen to this: Jessica Martinez Events doesn't just plan perfect celebrations, they create experiences that honor what matters most to their clients. Working with Jessica and her team felt like having family members who actually respected our vision and budget, rather than trying to impose their own agenda. They delivered everything they promised without drama or last-minute surprises. We couldn't recommend them more highly. Reading reviews like that still felt surreal, knowing that my reputation was built on the very qualities that had once been dismissed as unnecessary rigidity by family members who expected me to accommodate their constantly changing demands and unrealistic expectations. The business world, it turned out, valued consistency, reliability, and clear communication in ways that my family never had. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Williams, who had become an unlikely friend over the past 2 years. Saw the article about your business expansion in the paper. Congratulations. You've come a long way from that morning when you called about your stolen ring. Hope you're celebrating appropriately. Her message reminded me of how much courage it had taken to make that first police report, how terrifying it had been to choose justice over family peace, how uncertain I'd felt about whether I was doing the right thing. Now, with the perspective of time and success, it was clear that calling the police had been the first step in a journey toward a life built on respect rather than accommodation. The article Detective Williams had mentioned was a feature story in Austin Monthly about successful women entrepreneurs, focusing on how I'd built my business by refusing to compromise on professional standards or personal boundaries. The journalist had been particularly interested in the connection between my family experiences and my business philosophy, noting that someone who had learned to stand up to manipulation in personal relationships was uniquely qualified to navigate the challenges of running a service-based business. What the article hadn't mentioned was the ongoing cost of my transformation. My relationship with Rachel remained non-existent, and while I felt at peace with that decision, it sometimes created awkward situations at extended family gatherings. My mother still occasionally made comments about how nice it would be if the girls could work things out, but she'd learned to respect my boundaries around the topic rather than pushing for reconciliation. The most unexpected development had been hearing through family channels that Rachel was engaged again, this time to a man who apparently knew her complete history and had chosen to build a relationship with her anyway. According to my mother, Rachel's fiancé was a therapist who specialized in addiction recovery, and their relationship was built on principles of honesty and accountability that Rachel was still learning to practice consistently. I felt genuinely happy for Rachel's apparent growth and her opportunity for a fresh start with someone who understood her challenges. But I also maintained my decision to keep our lives completely separate, recognizing that some relationships couldn't be repaired regardless of how much individual growth occurred. Rachel's theft of my ring had simply been the final example of a dynamic that had never been healthy or sustainable. David closed his laptop and suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood to celebrate the new contract. Downtown Austin had become our home in ways that went beyond just living and working here. It represented the life we'd built together based on mutual respect and shared values rather than family obligations and inherited dysfunction. As we walked past the courthouse where we'd gotten our marriage license, David brought up a conversation we'd been having intermittently for months about starting a family of our own. The prospect of becoming parents felt both exciting and slightly terrifying, particularly given what I'd learned about how family patterns could perpetuate dysfunction across generations. I keep thinking about what kind of parents we want to be, David said, taking my hand as we crossed the street toward the river walk. Specifically, how we want to handle boundaries and accountability with our own kids, given everything you experienced growing up. His question touched on something I'd been processing in therapy for the past year. Understanding how my family's enabling patterns had shaped both Rachel's entitlement and my own people-pleasing tendencies had been crucial for breaking those cycles, but it had also created awareness of how easy it would be to repeat similar mistakes with children of our own. I think the key is teaching them that love includes accountability, I said, articulating thoughts that had been forming gradually over months of reflection. That protecting someone from consequences isn't actually protection, it's enabling. That healthy relationships require mutual respect and clear boundaries. We found a bench overlooking Lady Bird Lake and sat together watching kayakers navigate the calm water. The setting was peaceful, but our conversation was touching on some of the deepest lessons I'd learned about family responsibility and the difference between love and enablement. What scares me most, I continued, is the possibility of unconsciously recreating the same patterns my parents did. They thought they were being loving when they asked me to accommodate Rachel's behavior, but they were actually teaching both of us unhealthy relationship patterns. David nodded thoughtfully. But you've already broken those patterns in your business relationships, in our marriage, in your friendships. You've proven that you can create healthy dynamics when you're intentional about it. He was right. The skills I'd developed for maintaining professional boundaries, for choosing clients who respected my expertise, for building partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided accommodation, could certainly be applied to parenting. The key would be staying conscious about the choices we made and the messages we sent about respect, accountability, and the difference between support and enablement. Our conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing with a call from a potential client whose wedding had been featured in several national magazines. She'd seen the Austin Monthly article and wanted to discuss planning an anniversary celebration that would rival her original wedding in terms of elegance and attention to detail. As I took notes during our conversation, I felt the familiar satisfaction of being sought out for my expertise rather than my willingness to accommodate difficult demands. The client was asking thoughtful questions about my process, my timeline, and my vision for creating something unique and memorable. She wasn't trying to negotiate my prices down or pressure me into commitments I wasn't comfortable making. After ending the call, I realized that interactions like this had become the norm in my professional life, a stark contrast to the family dynamics that had once dominated my personal relationships. Business success had taught me what it felt like to be valued for what I contributed rather than what I was willing to tolerate, and that experience had fundamentally changed my expectations for all relationships. The sun was setting over the lake as David and I walked back toward our apartment, both of us carrying the sense of completion that came from a day filled with meaningful work and genuine connection. The engagement ring on my finger caught the last rays of sunlight, its familiar sparkle now representing not just our commitment to each other, but my commitment to protecting what belonged to me. As we reached our building, I looked back at the city skyline that had become the backdrop for the most successful and fulfilling period of my life. 2 years earlier, I'd been a woman who discovered stolen property and chose justice over family peace. Tonight, I was a successful entrepreneur, a happily married woman, and someone who had learned that protecting your boundaries isn't selfish, it's essential. The ring that Rachel had stolen and worn at her own wedding had ultimately led me to a life more beautiful and authentic than anything I could have imagined while I was still trapped in patterns of accommodation and enablement. Her attempt to take what belonged to me had taught me to protect what was mine, and that lesson had transformed every aspect of my existence. Rachel's theft had been intended to steal my joy, but it had ultimately given me the tools to build a life filled with genuine happiness based on respect rather than sacrifice. The woman who had called the police 2 years ago had saved more than just a piece of jewelry, she had saved herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.